He thought he killed her. He was wrong. Ethan Calloway sat across the boardroom table from the sharpest business mind he had ever worked with. A woman who read his every move before he made it, who fixed his mistakes before his own board even noticed them, who he trusted more than he had ever trusted another human being in his entire life. He had no idea he was looking directly into the eyes of the woman he buried 3 years earlier. He thought his son was a gift he finally earned. He was wrong about that too. For 3 years, Ethan Calloway was called less than a man in his own home, mocked, tested, medicated, humiliated by the family he married into, all because he could not give them what they demanded. And then, out of nowhere, he discovered a son already existed. A son he never knew about. A son that came from the single worst night of a 14-year-old girl's life. And instead of shame, instead of guilt, Ethan felt something else entirely. Relief. He built an entire war around that boy. Lawsuits, threats, lies so enormous they swallowed a child whole. He tore apart a family that never did anything except love a boy that wasn't theirs by blood, just to have something to finally call his own. And the woman he thought he destroyed years earlier was about to make sure he lost every single thing he built from it. This is the story of a man who thought his worst enemy was buried in the ground, when she was actually sitting 3 feet away from him, smiling, taking notes, and quietly ending his entire life piece by piece. Before we go any further, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, go watch it first, because what you're about to hear will hit 10 times harder once you know what he already took from her once before. Quick reminder of where we left off. At 14, Rebecca Wells was assaulted by 17-year-old Ethan Calloway. Her parents fought back, and it destroyed them. Manufactured deaths. Deaths made to look like accidents. Rebecca survived years on the street with her sister Grace, lost her to a car accident, and spent a decade rebuilding herself under a new identity, only to marry into the very family that destroyed her own, expose the truth, and send Ethan to prison. She thought that was the end. It wasn't. 3 questions are going to haunt you through the rest of this story. Who is the calm, brilliant woman sitting across Ethan Calloway's table, the one he trusts with everything, the one he never once suspects of anything at all? What did Ethan do the moment he discovered a son existed that he never knew about, a son born from the one night that should have destroyed him instead of rewarding him? And when the truth finally catches up to him, when everything he stole, lied for, and killed for finally collapses at once, will there be anything left of Ethan Calloway at all? Nothing in this story is what it looks like. Not the woman. Not the son. Not the man who thinks he's finally won. Ethan Calloway walked out of prison believing the worst was already behind him. He was wrong about that too. His father was gone, broken by a company that nearly collapsed without his son there to hide behind. His family's name, once untouchable, could no longer open every door the way it used to. So Ethan did what his family had always done. He married for money instead of love. A woman whose family had one condition attached to every dollar they handed him. Give us an heir. 3 years passed. Nothing. And his wife's mother made absolutely sure he felt every single day of that failure, dragging him from doctor to doctor, remedy to remedy, humiliating him in front of anyone who would listen, until Ethan started to believe there was something broken inside him that no amount of money could ever fix. Then, by pure accident, buried inside paperwork that had nothing to do with any of it, Ethan found out the truth. A son already existed. A son conceived the night he destroyed a 14-year-old girl's entire life and walked away from it without a single consequence. A son being raised, safely and lovingly, by a family that had no idea who his real father was. Ethan didn't feel guilt. He felt like he'd finally been handed exactly what he was owed. What he did next would destroy an innocent family, poison a child with lies too enormous for him to ever fully understand, and put Ethan Calloway on a collision course with a woman he already thought he'd buried in the ground years earlier. He was wrong about her. He was wrong about all of it. And he was about to find out exactly how wrong, one devastating piece at a time. Let's continue. Ethan Calloway's marriage to Victoria Hale had never been built on affection, and neither of them had ever pretended otherwise. The arrangement had been settled years earlier, quietly, over a dinner between Ethan's father, Charles Calloway, and Victoria's father, Walter Hale. Two men who understood that combining the Calloway name with the Hale family's considerable fortune would solve problems neither family could solve entirely alone. Calloway Enterprises needed capital after years of legal costs and reputational damage following Ethan's trial. The Hale family needed a respected name to attach to their own considerable wealth, one with enough history to make new money look old. There was one condition neither man stated outright in front of their children that evening, though both understood it perfectly, written instead into a private agreement neither Ethan nor Victoria ever saw until years later. The marriage needed to produce an heir, a child who would eventually inherit both families' combined fortune, cementing the arrangement permanently rather than leaving it dependent on a marriage built on nothing more than convenience. Ethan agreed to the terms without hesitation, the same way he had agreed to nearly everything his father asked of him his entire life. He had no reason, at the time, to believe fulfilling that single condition would prove to be the hardest thing he had ever attempted. 3 years passed without a single pregnancy. Victoria's mother, Eleanor Hale, had never been a woman who kept her disappointments quiet, and she made absolutely certain Ethan understood, at every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every quiet conversation in a hallway where she believed no one else could hear, that his failure to produce a grandchild reflected directly on him as a man. She began, in the second year of the marriage, referring to him in front of others with a particular cold precision, wondering aloud whether the Calloway bloodline had simply run its course, whether whatever had once made that family formidable had finally, quietly, died out along with Ethan's father's health. She sent him, without asking, to specialists in 3 different states, canceling his business schedule herself to accommodate appointments he had never requested and had no interest in attending. When Western medicine failed to produce the results she demanded quickly enough, she turned to herbal remedies imported from overseas, tinctures and powders Ethan was expected to consume daily, silently, without complaint, delivered to his office by Eleanor's own assistant with instructions written in her own hand, and a note reminding him that Victoria's happiness depended entirely on his cooperation. When those failed as well, she brought in specialists practicing forms of medicine Ethan had never encountered before that year, each consultation more expensive, more invasive, and more humiliating to endure than the last, conducted in private rooms at the Hale estate where Ethan often felt less like a husband and more like a patient being treated for a disease he had never actually been diagnosed with. Walter Hale rarely raised the subject directly, preferring instead to mention it only when Ethan had already failed at something else entirely, a missed quarterly projection, a stalled negotiation, a business decision that hadn't gone as planned. In those moments, almost as an afterthought, Walter would ask, in front of whoever happened to be present at the table, whether Ethan had any better news to share on the matter of an heir, since it seemed, lately, that good news of any kind had become difficult to find where Ethan Calloway was concerned. The room would go quiet each time, and Ethan learned, over those 3 years, to simply absorb it without response, the same practice stillness his own father had once used to absorb pressure from business partners far more powerful than himself. Victoria herself said very little during any of this, caught between a mother who blamed her husband entirely and a husband who had begun to withdraw further into himself with each passing month. She was not cruel to Ethan, but she was not particularly kind either, treating the entire situation as an unfortunate business complication rather than a personal one, which somehow made the isolation Ethan felt even sharper. By the end of the 3rd year, Ethan had begun to believe, quietly and with a fear he told absolutely no one, that he was simply incapable of fathering a child at all. It was a fear that sat beneath every other failure in his life that year, unspoken, constant, and increasingly difficult to separate from the man he had become since his release from prison. He did not yet know how wrong that fear truly was, or how devastating it would be to finally learn the truth. The truth arrived, as it so often does in stories like this one, through an entirely unrelated piece of business. Calloway Enterprises, still working to fully recover its standing 4 years after Ethan's release, entered into acquisition talks with a respected local company called Harrington Group, a family-owned firm that had quietly grown into one of the region's most stable and well-regarded businesses over 3 generations. as part of the standard due diligence process required before any acquisition of that size. Ethan's legal team combed through years of Harrington family records, financial and otherwise, searching for any liability that might affect the deal's final terms. Buried within those otherwise unremarkable family records, an attorney on Ethan's team found something that had nothing to do with the acquisition at all. A private adoption, finalized quietly approximately 16 years earlier, involving an infant left at the Harrington family's estate under circumstances the family had never fully disclosed to anyone outside their closest relatives. The timing, cross-referenced almost as an afterthought against dates Ethan's own legal team had memorized from his original trial years earlier, aligned precisely with the period surrounding Rebecca's disappearance from public record after her family's collapse. Ethan, when the report reached his desk, read it twice before he allowed himself to fully understand what it meant. He arranged, through channels that were not remotely legal, for a private paternity test to be conducted using a sample quietly obtained from the Harrington teenager, now 16 years old, without the family's knowledge or consent whatsoever, paying a lab technician enough money to guarantee both speed and silence. The results confirmed what Ethan had already begun to suspect the moment he read the adoption date. The boy, now known as Lucas Harrington, was his biological son. Ethan sat alone in his office that evening long after his staff had gone home, and felt something shift inside him that he would later describe, to no one who would ever repeat it, as the first genuine relief he had experienced in over 3 years. He was not, after all, incapable of fathering a child. He simply had never known, until that afternoon, that he already had one, and the knowledge arrived in him not as guilt for what had created that child, but as something closer to vindication, proof that Eleanor Hale's years of quiet cruelty had been aimed at the wrong target entirely. What followed was not a single legal filing, but a sustained, years-long campaign waged with the same patient cruelty the Calloway family had once used against Rebecca's parents, and for many of the same reasons. Ethan wanted the boy, and he wanted him entirely, without complication, without a rival family's claims standing in his way, and without any need to explain to Eleanor and Walter Hale exactly how this child had come to exist. He filed the first custody petition within a month of confirming paternity, arguing that a biological father had an inherent right to know and raise his own son, framing the original adoption itself as legally questionable given that Rebecca had been a minor at the time and had never named the father on any official record. The Harrington family, blindsided entirely and deeply protective of a child they had raised and loved as their own for nearly 16 years, fought the petition immediately with everything their considerable resources could provide, hiring the best family law attorneys the region had to offer. Ethan responded by escalating far beyond the courtroom. He used his renewed influence at Calloway Enterprises to quietly pressure several of Harrington Group's key business partners, making clear, without ever stating it directly in writing, that continued association with the Harrington family might prove costly to anyone who valued their own relationship with Calloway Enterprises going forward. Contracts began disappearing one at a time. Long-standing partnerships quietly dissolved under vague, unconvincing explanations. Within 18 months, Harrington Group, once one of the most stable companies in the entire region, was fighting for its own financial survival at the exact same time it was fighting in court for the right to keep raising the child it had loved since infancy. Ethan filed lawsuit after lawsuit, each one slightly different in its legal theory, each one designed less to win outright in a single ruling than to exhaust the Harrington family's resources, resolve, and legal budget one court date at a time. Depositions stretched for months. Motions were filed and refiled. The Harrington family's legal fees climbed into the millions while their business, quietly starved of its most important partnerships, could no longer easily absorb the cost. When legal and financial pressure alone failed to produce the outcome he wanted quickly enough, Ethan turned to Lucas directly, using the supervised visitations the courts had reluctantly granted him as the confirmed biological father to begin manipulating 16-year-old Lucas, taking advantage of the emotional confusion surrounding his origins and the conflicting stories about his past. He told Lucas, gently and patiently over the course of several visits, that he and Rebecca had been deeply in love once, young and foolish, far too young, he said, to fully understand what was right and what was wrong at the time. He told the boy that Rebecca had loved him completely, that their entire relationship had been genuine and real despite their age, and that she had chosen, for reasons Ethan claimed he still didn't fully understand himself, never to tell him about their child, robbing him, he said with practiced sadness, of nearly a decade with his own son. He told Lucas that his mother, wherever she was now, had made a choice to keep him a secret from the one man who would have loved him from the very beginning, while Ethan, the moment he finally learned the truth, had fought through every obstacle imaginable simply for the chance to know him at all. Every single word of it was a lie built directly upon the worst night of a 14-year-old girl's life, patiently reshaped into a tragic love story a confused, increasingly isolated 16-year-old had no reason to recognize as false. Lucas, caught between the only parents he had ever known and a wealthy, patient man who spoke of loving his mother with what appeared to be genuine tenderness, began, over many months, to quietly doubt the family that had raised him, exactly as Ethan had intended from the very beginning. Word of Lucas Harrington's existence eventually reached Eleanor and Walter Hale, and their reaction was immediate, calculated, and entirely self-interested. An illegitimate son, born years before Ethan's marriage to their daughter, threatened the very foundation of the arrangement their families had built together so carefully. If Lucas were formally recognized as Ethan's legal heir, the inheritance structure Charles Calloway and Walter Hale had negotiated years earlier, one that assumed any heir would be born within the marriage itself, would collapse into a legal complication neither family had ever anticipated or prepared for. Eleanor Hale, who had spent 3 full years humiliating Ethan over his apparent inability to produce a child, now turned that same cold, methodical precision toward eliminating the child who had already proven her wrong in the most inconvenient way imaginable. She pushed quietly and forcefully for Lucas to be formally disinherited through carefully worded legal language, for his existence to be handled privately rather than acknowledged publicly in any way, for the boy to be, in her own words spoken once too loudly at a private family dinner that a household staff member later quietly repeated to others, made to simply disappear from any conversation about the Calloway family's future entirely. Walter Hale pursued a quieter, more calculated approach of his own, offering the increasingly financially devastated Harrington family a substantial settlement in exchange for permanently relinquishing any remaining claim to Lucas and relocating far from the region entirely, effectively erasing the boy from both families' lives in a single transaction that would leave no legal or public trace behind. The Harringtons, exhausted, financially ruined, and utterly terrified of losing the only home Lucas had ever known even after everything Ethan had already cost them, refused the offer outright, choosing to fight for the boy they loved rather than accept a payment that would erase him from their lives forever. Caught between a wife's family determined to erase his son from existence entirely and his own obsessive, increasingly consuming need to claim that son fully and completely, Ethan grew more desperate with each passing month, increasingly convinced that the only people standing permanently in the way of the life he now believed he deserved were the two people who had already cost him everything once before. Rebecca, wherever she was living her quiet new life with Daniel, remained, in Ethan's mind, the final loose thread capable of unraveling everything he had built toward Lucas. If she ever learned the truth about her son, if she ever came forward publicly to challenge his version of events, every custody claim Ethan had fought so viciously for would collapse instantly under the weight of what had actually happened the night Lucas was conceived. Ethan made his decision alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home for the night, the same way he had made every important decision of his life. Rebecca and Daniel needed to disappear permanently, the same way Rebecca's own family once had, before either of them ever learned that Lucas existed at all, and before either of them could ever stand in a courtroom and tell the truth Ethan had spent years carefully burying beneath an enormous, elaborate lie. Rebecca and Daniel, unaware that Ethan had ever been released from prison, let alone remarried or fathered a child through the worst night of Rebecca's youth, had built a quiet life together in a small town several hours from anything connected to the Calloway name. Rebecca was pregnant again, nearly 7 months along on the night everything changed, carrying a second child she and Daniel had wanted desperately after years of healing from everything that came before. Daniel was driving them home from a routine appointment when the vehicle Ethan had arranged weeks earlier, its mechanical failure engineered by someone paid enough money to never ask a single question, struck them at an intersection they had crossed together, without incident, for over a year. The collision was catastrophic. Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. Rebecca was found barely alive, her face damaged beyond immediate recognition. The second child she was carrying lost in the very same instant that nearly took her own life as well. What Ethan did not know, and would never learn, was that a woman named Diane Ashford had been quietly watching Calloway Enterprises for years by that point. Her own daughter lost years earlier to a business deal Ethan had personally overseen and mishandled into ruin. Diane's people reached the scene within minutes of the collision, arriving with a speed that had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with years of careful, patient positioning. Diane made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of Rebecca's life. Rebecca was taken quietly to a private medical facility, far outside any official record Ethan could ever access to confirm his plan had truly succeeded in full. Rebecca survived, but woke weeks later remembering nothing at all, not her name, not Daniel, not Lucas, not the decade of pain and patience that had defined her entire adult life. Diane, seeing an opportunity born from a tragedy she had not caused but fully intended to use, gave the unnamed, memoryless woman her own late daughter's identity in full. A new face, carefully reconstructed. A new history, carefully documented. A new name, Claire Ashford. For nearly a year, Rebecca lived as someone else entirely, until fragments of her real life finally began returning, one devastating piece at a time, over the course of many difficult months, until she remembered nearly everything at once. Her family, Grace, Daniel, and finally, delivered gently by Diane after months of careful, quiet investigation into what had actually happened in the years since Rebecca's disappearance. The existence of a son she had never known survived infancy, a boy named Lucas, currently the center of a devastating custody war being waged by the very man who had once destroyed her entire childhood. Rebecca Wells, wearing a dead woman's name and face, made the same decision she had made once before, a decade earlier, standing frozen outside a window. She would not seek justice through any system that had already failed her family twice already. She would use the identity she had been given and the years of patience she had already proven she was fully capable of sustaining, to take back everything Ethan Calloway believed he had already won, including, this time, her own son. What followed over the next several years was Claire Ashford's quiet, deliberate introduction into Calloway Enterprises as Diane's protégé, a brilliant, trusted new partner Ethan welcomed into his inner circle with no memory whatsoever of the delivery girl who once stood frozen outside a window, or the wife of the cousin he believed he had successfully killed years earlier. Claire became indispensable to him almost immediately, her financial instincts sharp enough to earn genuine respect from a man who rarely offered it easily. The strategy Rebecca and Diane built together relied on a single, patient principle Rebecca had first learned watching the Calloway family operate against her own parents a decade earlier. The most devastating damage was never the kind anyone could trace back to a single source, and the most effective manipulation always offered real, genuine help just often enough to make the eventual betrayal completely unthinkable. Claire recommended a renegotiated supplier contract in her first year that saved Calloway Enterprises nearly $2 million, earning Ethan's complete trust almost overnight. She helped him navigate a hostile takeover attempt from a rival firm the following year, working around the clock alongside him for weeks, appearing, by every measure Ethan could see, entirely loyal to his success. She offered him small, genuine victories consistently enough that by the third year of her involvement, Ethan consulted her before making almost any significant decision at all, unaware that every piece of advice she offered was being carefully calibrated to serve a purpose far beyond Calloway Enterprises' quarterly earnings. Beneath that genuine assistance, Claire was quietly steering the company toward a collapse Ethan would never see coming until it arrived all at once. She recommended investments that appeared sound on paper and were, in fact, carefully engineered to fail just late enough that responsibility would always land somewhere else entirely, on a market shift, a supplier failure, a regulatory change no one could have reasonably predicted in advance. She quietly steered new contracts toward partners who owed their loyalty to Diane Long before they ever owed anything to Ethan Calloway. She identified, one by one, the specific board members whose confidence in Ethan's leadership was already fragile, and fed each of them, through entirely separate and untraceable channels, precisely the information needed to widen that doubt into genuine concern. At the same time, working through her own considerable influence, Diane began funding the Harrington family's mounting legal defense anonymously, ensuring Ethan's custody case would never simply exhaust their resources the way he intended. Diane's own legal team quietly identified the illegally obtained paternity test that had launched Ethan's entire campaign against Lucas, documenting its origins meticulously without ever revealing who had done the digging, preparing a case that would eventually unravel not just Ethan's custody claim, but everything he had built to support it. Rebecca insisted on being personally involved in protecting Lucas, even though the boy had no idea who she truly was. Through a series of carefully arranged, entirely anonymous contributions to the Harrington family's legal fund and quiet conversations with Lucas's court-appointed advocate, Claire Ashford ensured that someone was always working, invisibly, in the boy's best interest, undoing the damage of Ethan's lies one careful conversation at a time, planting doubts about Ethan's version of events the same patient way Ethan had once planted doubts in Lucas about his own adoptive family. Ethan's marriage to Victoria, already strained by years of pressure from her own parents, grew increasingly distant as Calloway Enterprises' fortunes began declining for the second time in less than 5 years. Whispers began circulating quietly at first, then with growing volume throughout the company and the wider business community, that Ethan Calloway simply could not be trusted to lead a company of this size, that whatever had once made the Calloway name synonymous with success had somehow died along with his father years earlier. Ethan, increasingly desperate and unable to identify the true source of his company's decline, leaned even more heavily on Claire Ashford's counsel, unaware that each piece of advice was drawing him steadily closer to a carefully engineered collapse Diane and Rebecca had been building toward for years. When the final blow arrived, it came not as a single dramatic exposure, but as the quiet, nearly simultaneous collapse of every load-bearing pillar Claire and Diane had spent years positioning beneath his company. Contracts evaporated within the same month. Board members withdrew their support within the same week. Financial obligations came due all at once, obligations Ethan had trusted Claire's counsel to manage safely for years. In the middle of this collapse, the illegally obtained paternity test that had started Ethan's entire custody campaign was formally exposed, delivered anonymously to both the presiding family court and state licensing authorities, ending Ethan's custody claim to Lucas permanently and exposing him to entirely new legal liability at the exact moment his company was collapsing around him. The timing ensured that Ethan faced total professional ruin and a reopened criminal investigation into Daniel and Rebecca's accident in the very same season. Ethan's mother, Vivian Calloway, who had endured her husband's death, her son's imprisonment, and years of quiet social decline with the same composed dignity she had maintained her entire life, finally broke completely under the combined weight of it all. The collapse of everything her family had built for the second time, layered directly on top of the reopened investigation into the very case that had first sent her son to prison years earlier, proved to be more than her mind could continue to hold together. She began, in the final months of this story, to lose touch with the world around her entirely, retreating into a private confusion from which she never fully returned, spending her final years in quiet, permanent care, unable to recognize even the people who visited her most faithfully. Ethan Calloway died before the reopened investigation into Daniel and Rebecca's accident ever reached a courtroom. The stress of watching everything he had rebuilt collapse for a second time, combined with a heart condition doctors later confirmed had been quietly worsening for years without his knowledge, ended his life during the same season his mother's own mind finally gave way entirely. He never learned that Claire Ashford had ever been anyone other than exactly who she claimed to be. He never learned that the delivery girl he had destroyed a decade earlier had been sitting across his own boardroom table for years, patiently dismantling everything he had left, one carefully placed piece at a time. Rebecca stood at the edge of that final collapse, watching a family that had once destroyed hers finally run out of anything left to lose, and felt, for the first time in over a decade, something closer to stillness than triumph. In the months following Ethan's death, Rebecca began quietly stepping back from Calloway Enterprises entirely, her purpose there fully complete. Diane, who had lost her own daughter to this same family years earlier, finally allowed herself to grieve fully for the first time in years, no longer carrying the weight of unfinished business alongside that grief. Lucas Harrington, freed from a custody battle that had nearly destroyed the only family he had ever known, remained safely with the Harrington family, who slowly rebuilt their business and their lives in the years that followed. Rebecca, through Diane's careful arrangement, was eventually introduced to Lucas as a family friend, a quiet, patient presence in his life that grew, over several years, into something neither of them fully named, but both of them clearly valued, without Rebecca ever needing to reveal the full truth of who she was to him before he was old enough to understand it fully himself. Rebecca returned, for the first time in years, to the modest cemetery where her sister was buried, and to the quiet grave marker that had once, briefly, carried her own name after the accident everyone believed had ended her life. She stood there for a long time, finally able to grieve Daniel properly, believing, as everyone else did, that his death had been the one truth in this entire story that could never be undone. She was wrong. Nearly 3 years after the accident that was supposed to have killed him, a man was found in a small coastal town several states away, living quietly under a name that was not his own, unable to explain who he truly was or how he had come to be there. A fisherman had pulled him from the water years earlier, barely alive, with no memory of his own identity and injuries consistent with a violent accident he could never recall. He had been given a new name by strangers who found him, the same way Rebecca once had been, and had simply never been found by anyone looking for him, because everyone who might have looked believed, with absolute certainty, that he was already gone. A routine medical scan, required for a minor procedure, finally revealed old injuries inconsistent with the story he had been told about himself. Dental records, run almost as an afterthought by a curious physician, matched a name no one had searched for in nearly 3 years. Daniel Whitmore was alive. When Rebecca received the call, she did not believe it at first. When she finally stood in front of him, in a quiet hospital room several states from the life they had once shared, she saw immediately that he did not recognize her at all, the same way she had once failed to recognize her own life when she was Claire. But where her memory had eventually returned in fragments over the course of a year, Daniel's return began somewhere else entirely, somewhere far simpler than memory. He looked at her for a long moment, confusion still heavy in his eyes, and said the only thing that felt true to him in that moment, the only thing that had apparently never fully left him even without a name to attach it to. He said he felt, somehow, like he already knew her. Whether the rest would ever fully return to him, no one could yet say. But for the first time since the night Ethan Calloway believed he had finally ended both their stories, Rebecca Wells stood across from Daniel Whitmore, both of them alive, both of them changed beyond recognition, and both of them, somehow, still finding their way back to each other, with a son waiting patiently to one day know them both fully, in a life finally free of the man who had spent his own life trying to take everything from them.